Hey folks, George here. Today we're going to start a discussion about the debate regarding drug legalization. Now, certainly there's been a lot of marijuana legalization across the United States over recent years, but the topic that we're going to discuss today regards all drugs, really. What are the details that matter and don't matter regarding drug legalization, yes? The first article we will tackle is by James Q. Wilson, entitled Against the Legalization of Drugs. So clearly, Wilson is against drug legalization. He starts by talking about the terrible heroin epidemic in the United States in the 1970s. He contrasts his own position with Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, a very libertarian economist. And Milton Friedman suggested that no government has the right to prohibit drugs. The government does not have the right to prohibit drugs, according to Milton Friedman. The government, of course, didn't listen to Milton Friedman and kept heroin banned, kept heroin illegal in the United States. And, according to Wilson, the heroin epidemic in the 70s stabilized. Here are some reasons that Wilson gives for suggesting that the heroin epidemic stabilized in the 1970s. Number one, bans keep drug prices high. So if drugs are banned, the price stays high. When drug prices are high, of course, the demand for the drugs decreases. Number two, the drug ban shuts down heroin-making facilities and factories. Number three, people are concerned for their health. And for those three reasons, number one, drug bans keep prices high. Drug bans shut down production of heroin, keep the supply low. And number three, drug bans encourage people to focus on their health. Those are the three reasons that Wilson says stabilized the heroin epidemic in the 1970s. Clearly here, Wilson focuses on the price and supply of drugs, of illegal drugs. And by manipulating the price and the supply of drugs, the government discourages people from taking drugs. What if, Wilson asks, what if we had followed Milton Friedman's advice? Of course, if the government had followed Milton Friedman's advice, drugs would be much more plentiful and available at much lower prices. Friedman counters and says, yeah, that might increase the number of drug addictions amongst the populace. However, that's not necessarily the case. I might say that according to economics, lower prices increases demand for things. So I don't know where Milton Friedman is coming from here. In fact, Wilson reminds us, Britain did follow Milton Friedman's advice. And in Britain, during the 70s and 60s, the number of drug addicts increased in Britain. It blew out of control. Wilson reminds us that drug use is not a victimless crime, as a libertarian like Milton Friedman might suggest. Number one, victims include the neglected children of drug-addicted parents, abused spouses, and the laziness in society. So all of society becomes less productive because of drug addictions. Wilson says society is not and could never be a collection of autonomous individuals. Thus, we need certain standards to keep society and human personality moving forward and keep going. Of course, Wilson recognizes that there's counters to his argument, and so he suggests, he acknowledges, Wilson does, let's talk about the claim that America lost the war on drugs. First, Wilson says, the war wasn't lost. It wasn't won. He acknowledges that it wasn't won, but it wasn't lost. Rather, it kind of stabilized. Furthermore, the drug problem was contained. He admits, Wilson does, however, that all of this and the drug war was a very expensive endeavor for American society. However, Wilson suggests that the cost of the drug war was worth it. The cost was worth it. After all, Wilson is appalled at some people who suggest that we should just let people kill themselves. He finds that an appalling sort of position to take. Even more, regarding the cost of the drug war, Wilson says it would have also been expensive to increase the cost of drug addicts and treating drug addicts. Drug addicts cost society a whole lot of money, Wilson says. And so, therefore, the drug war is actually worth it. What are the benefits of keeping drugs like heroin and cocaine illegal? Wilson gives us some examples. Number one, treatment of drug addiction has notoriously bad success rates unless it is long-term. Unless it is long-term. He says that many drug addicts might go for short-term treatment, but short-term treatment just isn't successful and isn't effective. The only way to keep drug addicts in long-term treatment, for better or for worse, is to force them, legally force them to attend by the law. Use the law to force drug addicts to attend long-term drug treatments. Even more, Wilson reminds us that anti-drug education would be less effective if drugs were legal. Just look at tobacco. We all say that tobacco is bad for people, yet look at all the kids that are doing tobacco. After all, if there's an adult doing tobacco, how can you justify saying that tobacco is bad for you, especially when it's so widespread and it's legal? The same thing, Wilson suggests, would happen if we legalized heroin, cocaine, and all sorts of other drugs. Wilson wants to remind us that regarding drug use, this is actually a moral problem. This is a moral problem to use drugs. Tobacco merely shortens one's life, while cocaine debases life. So the point here is that drug use and drug addiction especially debases and devalues the quality and diminishes the quality of life. Of course, there is an elephant in the room when you talk about debates regarding drug legalization, and that elephant in the room is the fact that alcohol is legal in America. How do you come to terms with that? Wilson knows he has to acknowledge this. Here's how he acknowledges this. He says there is no easy answer to that question. He acknowledges that that's a hard question. That is a contradiction in our society. So how do we face that contradiction? Primarily, he says that all the best evidence shows that cocaine, crack, and heroin, and all of these terrible drugs, are much, much worse than alcohol. Furthermore, and this is an interesting point, furthermore, in America, alcohol just has a different history than all of these other hard drugs. There is history. We have to come to terms with that history regarding prohibition and everything that came with that. So there is, for better or for worse, a certain history in America, and we have to acknowledge that history. And that is kind of his response to why this seems so contradictory, that we keep a terrible drug like alcohol legal, but he wants to ban heroin, crack, cocaine, and all sorts of other terrible drugs. Wilson admits that the government can't fix everything, but it can help cope with the harms and manage the harms of certain drugs. And, for better or for worse, the history of America is that it is better at coping with the harms and problems of alcohol use, legalized alcohol use, than with cocaine, heroin, and all these other terrible drug use. He leaves us with this sentiment, Wilson does. Human character is formed by society, and good character is less likely in a bad society. And so the crux of Wilson's argument here is a virtue ethics, or really trying to appeal to the notion of a flourishing life, and that our government and the laws in our government should encourage people towards a flourishing life. And it is a better life to not be a drug addict, and for that reason the government should discourage drug addiction and drug use. Another thing to understand about Wilson's position is not only does it base itself within the virtue ethics family, it also is based on a utilitarian sort of perspective as well. After all, utilitarians, if we recall, suggest the greatest happiness principle, the greatest happiness for all. That sounds a lot like Wilson when he says things like he cares about society, right? Human character is formed by society. Good character is less likely in a bad society. And so with that in mind, we should recognize that Wilson is taking a utilitarian sort of perspective as well. So those are the key ideas in Wilson's article against the legalization of drugs. See you next time. Bye-bye.